Good evening, everyone. My name's Joanna Cruikshank. I'll just briefly introduce myself before I do an acknowledgement of country. I'm a member of the congregation here at St Mark's with my husband and now our children. We've been here for about 17 years and we're part of the learning circle that meets monthly to learn and to try and better understand our responsibilities as followers of Jesus who live on stolen lands. I'm descended from Celtic and English people who about 160 years ago made the very poor decision to become colonisers, to leave their homelands and become part of the process of dispossessing Aboriginal people, starting out in Wathaurong country in what's now called Geelong. So since then, my family's been reaping the material rewards of that and I think also paying the relational and spiritual price of being part of the colonising culture and colonising process. So I'm trying to walk a different path, a more life-giving path, and learning how to do that. And I need a lot of help and support to take the kind of practical actions to make that happen. Hopefully to put my family journey in a different direction for my kids and my grandkids, and also, of course, for all the other kids and grandkids who are going to live in this place. So I'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we meet tonight on the land of the Kulin Nations, specifically the Boonwurrung people. And in my acknowledgement, I want to use the words of Amberlynn Quamelina, who's a Palaku woman who has written a wonderful book called Living on Stolen Land. And if you haven't had the opportunity to read that, we've read it in our learning circle and it's been one of those world-shifting kind of books. Also, it's extremely short, which is always, it's very accessible, so I do recommend it. She uses these words in relation to all Indigenous lands, and but I'm going to adapt them specifically in relation to this place. When we're in this place, she writes, we're on Boonwurrung lands, swimming in Boonwurrung waters, looking up at Boonwurrung skies. There's no part of this place that was not, is not cared for, loved by Boonwurrung people. There are no trees, rivers, hills, or stars that were not, are not someone's kin. So I pay my respects to the ancestors and to the elders of this country, and I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I want to also pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here tonight. Gary, I pay my respects to you as a Trollaway man, and to your country and elders. Roy, to you and your family, pay my respects to you as a Djadjarung man and to your country and your elders and to any other Indigenous people who are here in this room. So this event really came out of the reflections of our learning circle, which, as I said, meets monthly. We've done that for the past few years and we've listened to the voices of Indigenous people both in person and through their writings, through documentaries, through videos, to try and learn how we need to respond as Christians who are part of living on this stolen country. So I'm going to introduce our speaker and in doing that, kind of explain why, what kind of questions we're hoping he will address. Sorry, Gary, we have mentioned this. This is not a new set of questions. So the Reverend Canon Dr Garry Deverell is a Trelulwe man from Lutruwita, Tasmania. He's lecturer and research fellow in the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Divinity, which he helped to found. Not quite single-handedly, but pretty close to that, yeah. Dr Deverell's an Anglican priest, and he's currently a canon of the cathedral here in Melbourne. And he has a long history of pastoral ministry in a range of contexts. He has a PhD from Monash University, and he's published 2 books, Gondwana Theology in 2018 and The Bonds of Freedom in 2008. And I think I saw on Facebook that you've just got a publisher for the next book, which is awesome. And I believe that that is broadly on the theme of Christology and country. Yeah. Gary also has a really, really good blog. Blogging's kind of a bit out of fashion, but I have to say that reading Gary's blog has been amazing for our learning circle, and it's at uncommonprayers.blogspot.com, and I commend that to you. So we in the Learning Circle have benefited a lot from listening to Gary, both in person and in reading and reflecting on his work together. And so we were really pleased to see that Gary has recently undertaken the work, which I imagine is quite exhausting work, of speaking to non-Indigenous people both within and beyond the church about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the upcoming referendum, and the proposed voice to Parliament. We decided that we wanted to create an opportunity for those within our community and area to develop a clearer understanding of what is proposed in the referendum and what is at stake for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And we couldn't think of anyone more capable than Gary to speak on those questions. So thank you so much, Gary, for being willing to come and speak to us. So I'll just tell you briefly how we're going to do things. So Gary's going to speak for 45 minutes, and then we're going to break at 7:30. We will have refreshments at that time, but what we're going to ask you to do is to grab a cup of tea or coffee, grab something to eat, and bring it back to your table. And then we'd really like to encourage you to have a chat at your table about what you've heard, what your responses are, and to come up together with some questions that you would like Gary to answer, and maybe just 1 or 2 questions, and to write them in your best clear handwriting on the card that's on the table. And then Gary's kindly agreed to have a look at those questions and answer them for us if he can. If he can't, he's just going to chuck them. Yeah. Cool. So thanks again, Gary, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to St Mark's Spotswood for asking me along. Now, it's going to be one of those things where I've got the slides on my computer and I've got them up there, and as long as I coordinate both hands by clicking the slides forward at the same time, we might actually get through the talk. Oh, I've got to turn it on, haven't I? Yeah. There we go. So tonight we're going to address the big question, what is the voice? And hopefully we'll at least have some answers at the end of our time together, but hopefully also some questions. So in short, the voice is it's going to be a statutory body, that is a body that's brought into being by legislation. It'll be roughly 30 people, we think, at this stage, which would seek to represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to the federal parliament and the executive government. The voice would be actually elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's going to be gender balanced, and it's also going to include some younger voices in the room. Where the cut-off point between younger people and older people is, I don't know. In the church, it keeps going up. An important part of this is that the voice would be enshrined, that's the word that is being used, enshrined in the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia through the addition of a new chapter at the end of the Constitution. It'll be a very short chapter, as we'll see, but it will be a new chapter in the Constitution if the referendum goes through, which is the next point. In order to change the constitution of the country, that is the sort of basic foundational legal framework that everything else is built on, you have to hold a referendum. That is, you have to go to the electorate, that's all of us if we're over 18, except if you're in prison at the moment, but there's some discussion about that, and ask, is it okay if we change the constitution in this way? The concept of the voice didn't just arrive in someone's brain, a couple of weeks ago, although I have met people in the last week who thought that. The concept of the voice actually comes out of the work of what was called the Referendum Council, which was set up by two people who are who were the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in 2015, that is Mr Turnbull and Mr Shorten. And that the work of that council, that Referendum Council, reported to Parliament in May 2017. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details about what the Referendum Council did, but in summary, it got around the country and held a lot of consultations with Aboriginal communities and organisations. I remember going to one here in Melbourne, and it asked a whole heap of questions, got people to think about that before they actually came to the meeting, and then recorded all the responses and tried to collate what the guts of those responses was. And it was all about what needs to be done in order for Aboriginal people to have a better deal in this country. You may recall that when the council concluded its work, it did so at what was called a constitutional convention, which was held on Ananu country, Uluru, concluded on May the 26th of 2017, and the final report that was given to government included a one-page statement which is called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Which is there. And I'm not giving a lecture about the Uluru Statement of the Heart tonight, but I have been doing a lot of those in the last couple of years. So you'll recall that the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and therefore the Referendum Council's report to government, basically focus in on three central concepts. The concept of a voice, that is an elected group of people who would make representations to Parliament and the executive government about what Aboriginal people are thinking and working towards. The second is a treaty, that is talks between the federal government and a representative Aboriginal body in order to try and negotiate a more just settlement. And the last one, the last concept that's mentioned in those documents is the concept of truth. The idea being that unless we know the truth of what has happened in this country and what is still happening, then we're unlikely to be able to come up with something like a just settlement. Tonight, we're just going to focus on the voice part of that. And the voice is essentially this advisory body which would set up what is called a Makarrata Commission. That is a commission to work on the treaty and truth stuff and come up with some sort of advice for government around that. So this is a really important point. That background in the work of the Referendum Council and the Uluru Statements means that the establishment of a voice as an advisory body is not actually the end of the matter. The voice would become a key player in working towards a treaty between First Peoples and the federal government. And that is up front in those documents if you read them. That is one of the primary purposes of the voice. It's not just to advise government on all sorts of matters around Indigenous policy across a range of programs. The primary focus of the voice is to advise government on how to get on with the work of treaty making. It's important just for a moment to remember the different stages of government responses to that work of the Referendum Council and the Uluru Statement. So you may recall that just after the referendum report was tabled in Parliament and the Uluru Statement was promulgated around the country, that the Prime Minister at the time, Mr Turnbull, went to the Garma Festival in Nhulunbuy on Yolngu country up north and said, "We reject the work of the Referendum Council outright." I can believe anything. Now, obviously, Turnbull was out very soon after that, and we got another chap in power, the fellow on the left, Mr Morrison. On the right is his Indigenous Affairs Minister, Mr Wyatt. Now, it's interesting, there was a change between the Turnbull response and the Morrison response. The Morrison government decided to go ahead with designing a voice, as the Referendum Council report had asked, but not one that would be enshrined in the Constitution. So the idea was that the government would legislate so that there would be a representative Aboriginal voice, but because it wasn't enshrined in the Constitution, it could be done away with by subsequent legislation, which is, of course, is what happened with, Gough Whitlam's advisory body, Malcolm Fraser's advisory body, the Hawke Keating advisory body, which was called ATSIC, and that was the end of it, actually, for about 20 years. So again, under the Morrison government, a voice design committee was actually set up. And it worked very, very hard across about a year. It was chaired by Professors Marsha Langton and Tom Calma. Marsha Langton from Melbourne Uni and Tom Calma, Chancellor at ANU. And they worked very hard to design what a voice might look like. And they reported to the Parliament on their findings and their recommendations way back in July 2021. So this was all done, all this work was done while the Morrison government was still in power in Canberra. Then when the Morrison government was kicked out and the Albanese government was elected, a prominent part of the Albanese government's covenant with the Australian people as part of their policy platform upon election was that they would implement the main findings of both the Referendum Council report and the Karma-Langton report on the design of a voice. So that was something that they promised they would do when they came into power. So what happened then subsequently was that the First Nations Referendum Working Group was set up within weeks of the Albanese Government coming into power. It's been working away under the leadership of Linda Burney as the Minister for Indigenous Affairs within the Albanese Government, and Pat Dobson as the Special Envoy on the Uluru process. And so this task group, which is still working, has tweaked the design of the voice that was come up, that Tom Karma and Marshall Langton's group came up with. They've tweaked it a little bit, and we know a little bit of detail about what the tweaks are, but we don't know what the full version will be yet, because they're still working on it. We're told that it will be, 90% of it will map onto what Tom Karma and Marshall Langton have put forward, but there'll be a little bit of tinkering around the edges. So in order for the voice to come into being, you have to have a referendum. And this is what the referendum question is likely to be. A proposed law. So you walk into your little booth, right, like on election day. You walk into your little booth, and there before you will be a piece of paper with this written on it. A proposed law to alter the Constitution, that is the federal Constitution, not the Constitution of St Mark's, Spotswood, or the Anglican Church or anything like that, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you, the voter in that little booth, approve this proposed alteration? And there'll be two little boxes, one marked yes, the other one marked no. So there'll be no room for writing of essays reflecting upon this question. You'll just be asked to answer yes or no to that question. And that was announced just last week. That's the most likely wording. Now, for those of you who've been paying attention, this actually differs a little bit from the wording that was announced by Albanese at the Garma Festival in 2022, sorry. I'm still only just waking up to the fact that there was a change of century back in about 23 years ago. That's how up to date I am. The wording announced at Garma in 2022 as the most likely question was, do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? Shorter, sharper. There are some additional concepts in the new wording. There's the stuff about recognising the First Peoples of Australia. Recognising the First Peoples of Australia. And this is actually goes back to what was going on with, some of you may remember back in around 2013, 14, 15, there was a campaign called the Recognise campaign. The Recognise campaign was all about how do we recognise the fact that there were people here before everyone else arrived. Recognise that there are, in fact, First Peoples in this country, that we didn't all just arrive from 1788 onwards. So this is, in a sense, drawing upon that discussion that was going on back then, and the Recognise campaign was deeply flawed. I'm not going to go into all of that, but it is drawing upon that whole discussion about simply recognising in our foundational document that, in fact, there were Indigenous people here before everyone else turned up, because currently our Constitution does not recognise that. there is no recognition. So in other words, the Constitution is part of the terra nullius fiction. It's part of the instrumentation which has made terra nullius, empty country, part of the national mythology. So this is a way of saying, you know, one of the reasons why we want to mention Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution is simply so that our Constitution recognises that there were people here who had a sovereignty, a spiritual sovereignty, the Uluru Statement says, following Mabo, that pre-exists the sovereignty that has been asserted by colonising peoples post-1788. So that's partly what that additional recognised stuff in the new wording is about. In addition to the referendum question, the government has told us what that extra chapter in the Constitution is likely to look like. It hasn't said it'll be exactly like this, but they've said that this is the kind of thing that we're likely to put in the Constitution if we get a yes on the referendum question. Obviously, they can't do this if the answer is no. But if there's a yes, they're going to add at least 3 sentences, possibly 4, there's some discussion, but at the moment, as of last week, this is what is likely to go in the Constitution, and it goes like this. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Now, I want us to notice a few things about these sentences, just to take note of them. The first thing is it says there will be a body called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, but it says nothing about what that body will look like. It says nothing about, for example, how it will be elected, who will be on the electoral roll, whether there will be quotas representing particular areas of the country or particular nations or gender or age or any of those sorts of things. None of that detail is there. And the reason why that detail is not there is because constitutions tend not to detail things. They tend to be about principle, and then subsequent legislation that is based upon constitution is required to be consistent with those principles. Who decides whether legislation is consistent with principle? The High Court. It's the only body in the land that can determine that question. The second thing I want you to notice is that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice can make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. What matters would that include, do you think? What matters are important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Just have a stab. Treaty, anything else? Healthcare, education, all those kinds of programs that... Housing, yep. Closing the gap, all the stuff that's covered by the Closing the Gap report, indicators of poverty, levels of incarceration, etc. But what about things that Closing the Gap doesn't really take account of? What about things like the state of the environment, or whether there are Indigenous knowledges being taught in universities or whatever. Let me suggest to you that this wording says that Aboriginal people can make representations about anything that matters to us. So the initiative can actually come from the voice. They don't just sit there like shags on a rock, as my mum would say, waiting for government to come and consult them. They can take the initiative and go to government and say, this is really important to us. We think you should do some thinking around this. And while you're doing it, here's a whole bunch of stuff that we've been thinking about, which you might want to take into account. So the wording actually suggests that the initiative for what is important to us can come from the voice, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So it can be proactive, not simply reactive to when the government decides they want to consult. The third point I would make in relation to point 3 there on the constitutional sentences is that along with the Referendum Council report that's in the background of all of this, this is a really, 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 really conservative move to have a voice to Parliament. Because Aboriginal people will have no say in the following: how the voice is constituted, how the voice's input into government will find its way into policy, who will be on the voice, how voice people will be elected. Anything like that is actually, it says here very, very clearly, subject to the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia, it is the government, the Parliament, that decides all of that stuff. So we're not talking about a Sami-styled third chamber that has a budget and powers to run its own programs and do its own work. It is a purely advisory body that is constituted entirely according to the whim of Parliament. So there's a kind of a hedging of bets here. On the one hand, First Peoples are being recognised in the Constitution, which has never happened before, and a body is being set up which is enshrined in the Constitution and therefore makes it very difficult to get rid of. But the government of the day decides how the voice is constituted via its own legislative and statutory processes, and that means it can actually change it over time if it wants to. And it does not guarantee in any way, shape or form that what the voice actually says to government will change anything. Now, this is absolutely in keeping with the terms of reference that were given to the Referendum Council as it did its work. The primary term of reference was it had to be doable in the current political climate, which is very conservative. So we're not talking about any form of radical politics here. We're talking about incremental, largely symbolic change, at least at this stage. And I want you to hear that very, very clearly. So what will happen from here on in? I'll just check my watch. Oh yeah, we're doing all right. What will happen from here on in is that next week, legislation will be introduced into the Parliament to set up the referendum process. So in order to have a referendum, you have to have legislation which says, how the referendum will be run, who will run it, what the question will be, all that sort of stuff. It's the stuff that enables the money to be released and all that kind of thing. Now, when that legislation is introduced, there will also be a joint parliamentary committee set up. Yep, it's another committee, to receive submissions on the wording before it is finalised. So the government last week said, this is the likely wording, but this joint parliamentary committee can receive submissions on alterations to the wording before it actually becomes law. So there could be some tweaks, you never know. Then the legislation will go through the normal law-making process in the Parliament. So it'll be introduced on the floor of the House of Assembly, but then it will go to the Senate. And as you know, there can be a lot of argy-bargy about that. So again, the wording can be changed again, and there'll be negotiations going on late into the night, I bet you my bottom dollar, to try and change it. Now, there will be a sunset clause on that. They will try and get it done by the end of June, and hopefully the legislation will be passed by the end of June. And then once that is done, the government's intention, at least, is to hold a referendum between 2 to 6 months after that. So let's say that the legislation does pass at the end of June, and we do have a referendum process and referendum wording for the question. It's all set in stone in legislation, it's all passed. Then it'll be somewhere between 2 to 6 months from there. So it could actually be as late as January next year that the referendum happens. But they're still talking about having it in September. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. If anyone has a special line into the government's thinking, please speak now. Right, I didn't think so. Just a little reminder of what needs to happen in order to have a successful referendum. There are two parts to a successful referendum. You have to have the support of a majority of voters in a majority of states. Not territories, by the way. They only count the states for this bit. So, you know, Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland and Tasmania. The votes that come in from the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory, and indeed some of those minor territories which we rarely think of, off the coast of Australia, any votes from there don't count in this particular part of the algorithm. So you only have to have a majority of voters in a majority of states for that first part. But that's only the first part. The second part is you have to have a majority of voters overall nationally. So if you count all the votes, including those from the territories, you have to have a majority across the entire nation. You have to have 51% or 50 point whatever percent of votes across the nation, but you also have to have 4 of the states voting in favour more than 50%. A lot of referendums, as you know, for those of you who study these things, actually fail because they don't meet either one or the other of those criteria. So it's a big ask. And the first poll that I've seen post the announcement of the potential wording last week measured the vote across the whole country at about 60%. But they haven't actually done it state by state to see what it's likely to do. And of course, the polls are always right, aren't they? Yep. Now, one of the things that I think it's really important to recognise is that a lot of the detail about the design of the voice is out there. There's this really helpful website that you can go to, which is right there, Voice, National Indigenous Agency, government.au, final report. And you can read the CAMA Langton report right there. It took me about half an hour to read it. It took my daughter about 10 minutes to read it because she's a lot smarter than I am. And it has some nice pictures in it and graphics and things. So it's there. So, and the government has said we're going to go with most of what's already there in that report. And the group that's been meeting and working on this under the Albanese Government has said we're accepting most of what that report says in terms of the voice. So when certain politicians say, where's the detail, as the former Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Ken Wyatt, said, read the damn report. I'm paraphrasing. The report provides for the election or appointment of people to a national voice out of local voice bodies. So according to the Karma Langton report, the first stage will be to set up sort of local voice bodies around the nation, and out of those bodies would be elected this national body. I don't think that's actually going to happen. I think that's one of the things that might change. I'm going to skip this diagram because it's actually not very helpful, and I'm going to go to this diagram. This is what's in the Karma Langton report about how the voice would be constituted. And I've nicked this diagram right out of the report, okay? I didn't sit down for hours and design this myself, I nicked it. So the Karma Langton report says that the voice would have 24 members. And it makes a distinction between what it calls base members. I don't think morally base, just kind of, foundational is what is meant here. Base members, which are all the people who are kind of in those dark circles, right? And then it talks about additional members to represent particularly remote communities, and also an additional mainland Torres Strait Islander member. So up there in the top right-hand corner, you can see that there's 2 base members to represent the Torres Straits, but also an additional Torres Strait Islander member. So the Torres Strait Islander, and that person would actually be representative or give some cognizance to the fact that there's huge numbers of Torres Strait Islanders that actually live on mainland Australia. In fact, most Torres Strait Islanders now live on mainland Australia, okay? But if you go around, you'll find that actually the base members would all be elected on a kind of state basis. So 2 members from the Northern Territory, 2 members from WA, 2 members from South Australia, and so on and so forth. But they've added in an extra person in some places to recognise that there are significantly sort of large remote communities in those states. So they've put in an extra member for WA, an extra member for the Territory, an extra member for Queensland, an extra member for New South Wales, but apparently there are no remote communities in Tasmania, Victoria and the ACT. I think Tasmania is as remote as you can get, personally. So I think we deserve 2 more members because of being extra remote, but that's unlikely to get through. One of the ways in which the current group is likely to tweak this model is to bump it up to about 30 members. So they reckon that they'll probably put in an extra person around the country as well to bump it up to about 30 members. So this may quickly become 30, but no more than that, because it would just become too unwieldy and impractical. So will the voice design, as it's there in the Karma Langton report, change? The answer is possibly and even probably. So the main criticism and feedback about the report is that setting up local voices to elect a national voice is overly complicated. And so what people have said is that wouldn't it be better to just let existing Aboriginal controlled organisations or land councils or elders councils that actually exist in the various states, make them eligible to nominate people to go on the voice body, but then all of the Aboriginal members of who are on the electoral roll within a particular state participates in the election. So nominated by Aboriginal controlled organisations, land councils, elders councils, etc. But then everyone who is Aboriginal on the electoral roll gets to vote for which they would prefer to have. I think that is likely to get up, because I think the whole thing of going through a process of setting up local voices on a sort of state-by-state basis is in some sense redundant, because all of the states are doing that anyway, you know, starting with Victoria, with its Assembly of First Peoples. Is the proposed voice a third chamber of parliament? Well, no, we've said, because it won't have any constitutional power to introduce or change or even veto legislation. As I've said already, it would also have no power or money to run its own programs and projects, so that whole third chamber of parliament stuff has never really been part of the thinking at all. But let me get to perhaps the nub of the question for many of us, because this is all very interesting. But I think a key question is the proposed voice a priority for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? And I think the honest answer is, for some, yes, for others, no. And I want to talk about basically three sort of groups or blocks here. So obviously, you know, the most prominent block is associated with the people who authored the Uluru Statement, who were on the Referendum Council and were at the Constitutional Convention in Uluru in May 2017, 17, that's right. You know, so Professor Megan Davis, Pat Anderson, Noel Pearson, they're the main public face of this particular approach. They say that we need the voice first, because if we don't have a voice, then there's no representative body that can actually talk to government about what else happens after that. All you've got is, you know, lots of different Aboriginal groups from all over the country continuing to make representations, but the government just plays one group off against another, you know, and you never get anywhere. So we're better off having a national elected voice, which is enshrined in the Constitution, because then that group can negotiate with the government about where we really want to go, and that is to treaty. When all these consultations were held around the country, both by the Referendum Council, but then also by you know, Langton and Karma, the number one priority in all of those consultations was treaty. A more just set of arrangements between ancient sovereign holders and more recent sovereign holders of the country. So that clearly is the biggest block, and they're the people who are driving the current process about the voice. So their answer to the question is, yes, we need the voice. We need it first, and unless we get that in place, then all this other stuff is very unlikely to happen, is their argument. There are other people, and I would put Professor Chelsea Watego and Dorinda Cox, Green Senator for Western Australia, in this sort of group. And I'd probably put myself in this group as well. Argue that all three aspects of the statement can actually be progressed together. That we don't have to wait until we've got a voice in place before we can start working on treaty arrangements, rules around how treaty talks might unfold, you know, truth commissions, those sorts of things. We don't actually have to wait. You can work on all three at once, and in fact, The perfect example of that is what's happening here in Victoria. In Victoria, we have a First Peoples Assembly, which is a voice. We have a Truth Commission, the Yurruk Justice Commission, and we also, of course, have a treaty process which is going to start in just a few months. We've already agreed on what the rules of the talks will be. We've already got an independent umpire. We already know who's going to be involved in the talks. It'll be the First Peoples Assembly that we've elected, and we're going to have another election before the treaty process takes place, because it's been 5 years since it was elected. So all of that's actually been happening together and legislated into being together by the government. So all three are happening at once here in Victoria. And I don't see entirely why we have to have the voice in place and settled down until we can move on to other questions. There's a third group of leaders who would say that we need a treaty first before we can deal with questions of truth commissions, for example, and any kind of elected Aboriginal body that would relate to government going forward. The argument here is that Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people, do not need to be recognised in the constitution of the coloniser. We are already a sovereign people, and therefore why can we not just talk to government at federal level, state level, local level, ourselves, out of our existing organisations, to arrange better representation, better outcomes? And they would also say that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples should be a foundational document for any such talk around treaty, and that one way of making sure that these voices are heard is to actually set aside seats in the Parliament, such as they have done in New Zealand, for example, Aotearoa, New Zealand, especially for Indigenous people representing Indigenous communities rather than a geographical sort of region. Now, my view on that is that it's pie in the sky when you die, folks. I think that the fact is that you know 95.5% of the population of Australia is not Indigenous. Therefore, the current representative processes that we have in the country represent very, very well that other 95.5%. And unless we can organise at a national level to talk to government at a national level, then there will be no national progress on this stuff. There might be local progress, which will be entirely dependent upon the goodwill of the particular government that is in power at the time. But it can all be undone if you get another group of people in, local government, state government, federal government, etc. And you're suddenly back to square one again. So while these people, you know, very prominent people, Gary Foley, Lydia Thorpe, Michael Mansell, amongst others, these folk come out of an activist sort of background and tradition, which is primarily focused on treaty. And, you know, they're talking out of, I think, an understandably long, you know, a long period of attempting to get things done and finding out that their advice is not taken. So a lot of these people have sat on advisory governments like The Voice and found that governments don't really listen to what they have to say. So why would a new representative body, even if it is enshrined in the Constitution, be listened to by government? So they've got a good point, but I just don't think that they've put anything on the table which is doable and practical in a country that is 95.5%, you know, colonists. So there's a realpolitik that I don't think has really dropped entirely for these brothers and sisters, in my opinion. Of course, there's a final group represented here by Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, who argue that we've got Buckleys in trying to do anything special for Indigenous people, nor should we do anything special for Indigenous people, except try and improve health and education outcomes, all the stuff that's in the Closing the Gap report. So let's do that as a whole nation, but we don't need to have, a special group elected. We don't need to have a treaty. We don't need to do any of that. We can just get on with, as a nation, trying to improve the lot of Indigenous people. The answer, of course, to that is, well, we haven't made a lot of progress on the Closing the Gap measures since that reporting structure was brought in, and therefore, how are we likely to make any further improvements on that going forward, unless there's a national voice for Indigenous people? That's it. That's all I got. So I think now we're going to go and grab a drink, and you can digest your food and your drink, bring it back to the tables, right? So that you can not get stuck out there, but come back into your table groups and have a bit of a talk about some of the things that I've mentioned, and formulate any questions or comments that you want to make from your table, and then I will try to address those as we go forward. Thank you. Turn that off. So there's a lot of questions here. I suspect that some of them will overlap with each other, so I'm not going to necessarily answer every question verbatim as it comes, because some of them will already have been covered, but I'll just go through them now and see where we get to. So I've got a question here about the South Australian voice and how it fits in with the national voice. It doesn't, really. I mean, the same principles are in play, the idea that you have an elected Aboriginal body that speaks to government. It's just that it's happening at the state level with state government rather than at the national level with national government. So that's the only difference. It's actually about levels of government as we have it in our existing constitution for Australia. So it's a similar body, but it will only speak to the South Australian Parliament rather than national Parliament. For those who have yet to make up their mind, what are the main objective they may have? What are the main objectives they may have? Objections, sorry. It's a long time since I've done this stuff, so everything I read these days is typed, so my apologies. Well, I think the main objections are the ones I mentioned in the talk. From there are not all Aboriginal people are keen on the voice, and for different reasons. I think that it would be true to say that it's probably the direction that's being taken by the people who promulgated the Uluru Statement and everything that follows from that, and have the era of government, are very clearly in the majority, But I think that in a democracy such as ours, just as the rest of the community has many voices, and democracy works if everyone gets heard, and those things are all taken into account when people are making decisions about policy and voting and all that sort of thing, that luxury should also be afforded to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And I think it's perfectly fine for people to step up and say, well, I think that's fine, but I'm not sure that this will work, or I think the whole thing is a load of rubbish, or whatever. As long as people are stating their view and then and doing so in a considered way, so that it's not just throwing stones for the sake of throwing stones, would be my view. Yeah. So I think the way I represented the various voices at the end of the talk, I think that's pretty much what's out there at this stage. What is the reason politicians such as John Anderson are saying no? See Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine. It's exactly the same reasons for the campaign there. Marsha Langton has said that she thinks any rejected advice by the Voice to Parliament would be challenged in the High Court. Will it become a lawyer's picnic? Marsha Langton hasn't said that. The Leader of the Opposition has said that. I think he's actually wrong, because what the Leader of the Opposition is worried about is that the Aboriginal voice can give advice to executive government, which could be challenged in the High Court. Anything that the Parliament produces by way of legislation can be challenged in the High Court. So that's just a truism that doesn't necessarily get us anywhere. That objection could be raised about everything that the Parliament does. And the reason we have a High Court is so that it can consider objections to legislation which are claimed to be unconstitutional. So I think the Aboriginal voice to Parliament will be no more litigious than anything else that's already in the Constitution. That's, I think, the simple answer to that question. How will the voice improve the lives of rural Indigenous people who are probably the most needy? Well, I'd challenge the second half of that question, that rural Aboriginal people are the most needy, because if you look at the demographics and the statistics that are collected very, very carefully by the people who put the Close the Gap Together report, for example, and the Bureau of Statistics, what you'll find is that urban Aboriginal people usually have the same disadvantages as people in the bush. The same levels of mental illness, the same likelihood of being incarcerated, the same levels of poverty and so on, same levels of educational disadvantage. The differences are very, very slight. So I would actually challenge the second part of that question. How will the voice improve the lives of all Indigenous people? Well, in theory, the voice can talk to government in a national united way about the gaps in policy. And what Indigenous people have been arguing for since one of my own ancestors, Manala Genna, talked to the Governor of Tasmania, Governor Collins, in 1828 about what we need, is that, generally speaking, governments don't do what we suggest that they ought to do, which is hand our own affairs over to us to run. So, and even with the advent of Aboriginal controlled organisations, health services, legal services, etc., the compliance issues around running those organisations are extraordinary. So you could argue that we're only allowed to operate in this country under colonial models of management. So I think that one of the things that the voice can do is argue for alternative structures to manage our own affairs, starting with governance, but also going down to the grassroots level when it comes to service delivery. Will the voice personnel be seen as public servants or lobbyists? How will they be paid? They will be seen as, they will be paid like government advisors. So you may not be aware of it, but the government has lots and lots of statutory bodies that advise it already. So it'll be a similar model in terms of the way that, that people are paid. They'll just be paid like every other advisory body that currently exists in the Commonwealth. Interestingly, just reflecting on that question half a second later, it seems to be uncontroversial that there be lots of other statutory bodies that advise government, but somehow it's very, very controversial if there's an Indigenous body that advises government. Why is that? Ask yourself that question. Clarifying question. Oh, prisoners. Prisoners not able to vote in the referendum? Currently not, under the sort of existing legislation. But there is some talk about, with the legislation that will be introduced into Parliament this week, that there might be a provision for allowing Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people who are in prison to vote. Now, the reason for that is that, of course, huge numbers, disproportionately huge numbers of our people are in prison right now. You know? Juvenile justice system, even in Victoria, 62% Aboriginal kids, right? So, because of the disproportionately high numbers of Aboriginal people in prison systems, in the justice system, if they were excluded from voting in the referendum, that would exclude a disproportionately large part of the Indigenous population. So the Greens, for example, have suggested that the legislation to set up this referendum should explicitly make it possible for prisoners to vote. And I agree with that. What are the main camps of non-Indigenous people's response to Voice? I don't know. Sorry, I have no expertise in what non-Indigenous people think about the Voice. With the current wording, what is to stop the government putting non-First Nations people on the Voice? That won't happen. The only way you can be eligible for election to the Voice is if you are a recognised member of an Aboriginal community and are on the Aboriginal electoral roll. So that means that there'll be no non-Indigenous people elected to the Voice. A related question, who will be defined as a voting Aboriginal person to be elected for the Voice? Recognised as an Aboriginal descendant or cultural Aboriginal? It's not a distinction I'm familiar with, but as I understand it, there will be no change to the currently widely accepted tradition that if you're recognised as being Aboriginal by an Aboriginal organisation, then you are Aboriginal. The language of the prompt implies the Voice can offer suggestions to the government. This then makes one wonder if the government can take advantage of the may and sweep advice under the carpet. What do you think? Yes, it can. I mean, it's a conservative proposal. I think we need to understand that this is a super conservative proposal because as I've been saying, it came out of this long process where there were terms of reference that were set for the research and the writing and the reporting that had to be done. So the government the Parliament, in a bipartisan way, actually at the beginning, was in charge of this whole process from the beginning and continues to hold all the cards, right? And that will continue to be the case until we get to the other side of a treaty. Because the whole point of having treaty conversations is you can change the balance of power. You can perhaps even have a new constitution, right? But on this side of treaty talks, the government will have all the cards because that is the system that we work in. And, you know, since the government set up the process and the terms of reference for the process, there was no chance that there were going to be radical proposals outside of that. They were always going to be according to what, you know, you might want to call the realpolitik approach. That is, it has to work in a conservative electorate with conservative governments, which is what we've had in this country for a long, long time. So any change is going to be incremental. And the idea is that hopefully with incremental change, it'll sneak up on people and eventually we'll have radical change. But it's not, we're not going to go from here to there like Lydia Thorpe would like us to do, or Michael Mansell would like us to do. It's just not going to happen. It has to happen slowly, is the argument of the people who are behind this whole process. And on that, I think they're right. I think that if we took, for example, a proposal for a third chamber of Parliament, like a Welsh Parliament or a Sami Parliament to the Australian electorate at the moment, it would fail miserably, because there's so much argy-bargy around having an advisory group with no power that something like that is bound to fail. I think that's very, very clear. So this is a conservative, possibly the most conservative proposal possible. If this fails, heaven help us. May we have a copy of your slides and share them with our communities? It'll be on the recording. Do those in favour of progressing voice, treaty and truth telling together generally support a yes vote? Yes. So those of us who think that you can work on all three together, which includes me, I've self-identified in that sense. Yes, we think anything that gives Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people more say in the colonial structures that we live with every day is a good thing. Now, obviously, we'd like to have more say, the other side of treaty talks, in recognition of all the damage that's been done and that sort of thing. But anyone who says to us, do you think Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a bigger say in the country? I'm going to answer yes to that, however conservative the proposals happen to be. Is it possible, or could you imagine a no vote being a good outcome? No, I can't. If we get a no vote, then I think that will mean that as a country we're even more conservative than we were when we elected the Howard government in 1993. I call this whole process back to 1993, right? In 1993, we had an elected advisory body to government. It was called ATSIC. It had problems. No one disagrees with that. It had problems, but it was the very first elected body set up by the Hawke-Keating government, and we started to make progress on a whole bunch of stuff under those arrangements. But then there was a change of government. ATSIC disappeared, and we went into what I call the sort of the abyss for the next 30 years. And now we're back to 1993. It's just that it's 2023 now. So in a sense, what we're doing now is we're picking up the conversation that we were having in 1993. And if you don't believe me, just Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo, whatever your preferred way of doing it is, Paul Keating's Redfern speech. And you will find that the stuff that is in that speech sounds very, very radical to our ears today. Why? Because we are a much more conservative community now than we were in 1993. And that's because of the kinds of governments that we've had, I would argue. What do you see as the role of churches and other religious communities to see this referendum carried? I reckon it's a really good idea to hold forums about it and invite Aboriginal people along to ask them what they think. I think that's a really good idea, so you might want to have a think about doing one of those. I also think just talking with it amongst, with each other. Setting up intentional conversations with the groups that you have in your church, inviting other people to do the same. There was this saying back in the Billy Graham days, so I'm told, I wasn't around then, but gossip the gospel. Well, gossip the Uluru Statement is what I would say. What sort of fear-mongering needs to be defeated or counted. The usual kind. I think a lot of the fear-mongering actually comes from fear. It's people who don't want to lose control of the country. You know, colonists have had control of this country and indeed of the very bodies and souls of Indigenous people for 235 years. Some people are afraid of letting Aboriginal people be ourselves and make the contribution we can make out of our long ancestry and history and spirituality, which predates yours in the orders of, you know, hundreds of thousands of years. But, as the Uluru Statement says, quite rightly I think, if people can get past their fear and see what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can contribute to this country as a gift rather than a threat, then I think that turns the whole thing around. I would encourage you to see the kind of contribution that we could make if we're freed to be allowed to make that contribution as a gift rather than a threat. How do the design principles fit into the picture? Who did them? Still a guide. Well, the design, as I said in the talk, the design was done by the Referendum Council in the first place, and then the Karma Langton Committee, which worked for a year and consulted right across the country and came up with the report on the design of the Voice, which was then considered by the current government. First by the Morrison Government, but it didn't do anything with it, it kind of disowned it. But now with the Albanese Government, it's being considered and it will have a big impact on the way that the Voice is designed. If we have a referendum, that just says go ahead and create the Voice. So there's lots of talk about what the Voice might look like, and there's reports and there's a sort of preferred model that's being generated as we speak. It's almost finished, I'm told, by one or two insiders. But there's no point in doing any more work on it unless you get a yes on the referendum, because if the referendum says no, we don't want a voice, an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, then there's no point. You just have to dissolve those committees immediately. So that work will continue apace if we get a yes on the referendum. If we don't get a yes, it won't go ahead. How do we make the truth-telling process positive, enabling? Positive and enabling for who? I would argue it has to be positive and enabling first for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, because we're the ones who have suffered because of the frontier wars, the removal of children, the stealing of land, the incarceration of our people, the impoverishment, and so on. So it first has to be fruitful and positive and enabling for us. But I would then argue, as the Uluru Statement does, that it's in the interests of the rest of the country to see us rise. Because if we rise, then the whole country will rise. My colleague, Professor Anne Patel-Gray, has been saying for years that until this country deals with its original sin, we will all, not just Indigenous people, we will all continue to have to deal with the consequences of that. And so this is actually a project for the whole country. And I think very generously, I mean, I said I wouldn't talk about the Uluru Statement tonight, but here I am talking about it. I think very generously the Uluru Statement invites the whole, it's written to the whole people of Australia, not just the politicians. It's actually a letter addressed to the whole nation of Australia, inviting everyone to walk with us and figure this shit out, you know? So the invitation is there, so the ball is in your court. That's the end of these questions, but I'm wondering if there's anything that anyone wants to say from the floor. I think there's a couple of microphones so that it'll turn up on the recording. Remember, you're being recorded, you know, and therefore you can be sued. No. Any other questions? Over there. Sorry.
You made reference to possibilities of election versus nomination. I think there is some concern about nominations that might lead to mates, whatever relations, getting in on the...
What, like in the rest of the community?
That's right. That's right. So who nominates, or who is likely to... You said land councils. Now, do they see representing...
I said Aboriginal controlled organisations, land councils, councils of elders, in other words, recognised Aboriginal organisations nominating people. But then the whole Indigenous electorate would elect those people. So actually it's a very similar situation as you have in the rest of the community, where people are nominated for election to Parliament, or to local government, or to a whole range of bodies, by political parties, by interest groups, by lobby groups, etc. And then people elect them. They choose amongst the nominees. So it's actually not a different system at all. But somehow there's this concern that if Indigenous people do it, ooh. But the rest of us, that's fine. We can do that, no problem, because we're good people, but they might stuff it up, which is, I suggest to you, a deeply colonial point of view. Yep.
Can I ask how you're feeling?
I'm feeling knackered, but not for the reasons you might imagine. It's just a lot to do at the moment. Yeah. I mean, I'm not convinced, you know, I don't know how this referendum will go. I don't know. Polls are always wrong, as we've discovered in every election since about 2007, you know. So I just don't know. But it will be a test of the mood and the conservatism of the electorate, I think. Yep.
My name's Juliet. I'm a Yorta Yorta Dudjadurong girl. I'm also working in healthcare. I was wondering if you'd have any insight on what this... I know that we don't know the exact scope of what this voice will be able to do, but do you have any estimates on how it would be able to impact the healthcare system? Because at the moment we don't have enough representation for our patients and their trauma in the healthcare system.
Yeah. So in theory, again in theory, the theory is that a voice, you know, we're kind of a long way from getting to where we want to get to. Where we want to get to is justice in healthcare as well as in everything else, right? It's a long, long road to get there. Initially, the voice would talk to government about improving healthcare, but hopefully we can also get to the other side of treaty talks, where there are arrangements put in place for properly funding Indigenous controlled health organisations, so that you know, and that out of reparations money essentially. So that means that there would be, you know, infinitely bigger and better capacity for us to start dealing with the issues that we face on the ground. But, you know, there's a journey. We've got a long way to go, you know. So if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as you know, have got anything, it is patience.
Because I've worked with about 4 hospitals, and I reckon only one of them has had an adequate Indigenous
Yeah.
representation team.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was further out, which was the high demand.
Yeah. In most healthcare services, you know, you do a little PD session on the computer for half an hour to learn about Indigenous people, and that's all that's required. And there's nothing else going on.
May I just say I've been to those?
Yeah.
And with all due respect, I understand that people work hard to put those together. I don't think it adequately encapsulates what our patients are going, the abuse and trauma they've experienced, and then how we as practitioners can work on it in the healthcare industry.
Yep.
So I would be interested to see how we could bring voice into the healthcare system regarding actually promoting education.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Has everyone run out of puff? No? Couple more? Barbara?
Gary, what's your best prediction of what will happen if this referendum fails? I'm talking about, I suppose, what will happen to the whole Indigenous situation in Australia and to us, as non-Indigenous.
Well, look, I think we'll just see a bigger version of what's happened before with various disappointments. So what happens is, in our history, if promises are made and then nothing eventuates, we tend to have two responses. One is to become very, very depressed, which is to internalise our anger, or we become very, very angry and take to the streets. I think you'll get both of that happening, but on a much, much bigger scale than we've ever seen before in this country. So I think if the referendum fails, you will see huge marches and they will go on and on and on and on. But you will also see a huge spike in mental health problems, suicide rates, and all those kinds of things. So I think that's what will happen. That's just induction from what I've seen before in the past. Yeah. Last question, I think. Thank you.
Recently, I was having a small part of a small gathering at a bowls club, and the topic came up, and I was totally surprised and disappointed that nobody at that table had the slightest idea of what it was about, and made all sorts of comments, some of which you've already addressed, but they were adamant that they were going to vote no.
Yeah.
So I think that in terms of, I mean, that's only a microscopic sample, but I think we've got a long way to go to even raise the topic.
Yeah, I think that is the reality in large sections of the community. So, yeah. Look, I think, maybe we should have, Uluru Statement in the pub or something like that instead of faith in the pub, or, maybe it's the same thing. But yeah, it does seem to me that for a lot of the electorate, there's a kind of I don't know and I don't want to know, because of this fear thing. Fear of letting go of control, being at the top of the apex, or however you want to think about it, and having to share those sorts of things are very, very fearful for a lot of people. And it's not about what's going on in the head, it's about what's going on down here. And this is where most of what I call the colonial imagination is actually located. It's located in our feelings rather than in our heads. So the only antidote for shifting people's feelings, I think, is to actually get Indigenous people in people's faces being articulate. That's the only way, because that way you can start to undo all of those caricatures of Indigenous people which are increasingly completely and utterly wrong. It's exactly the same process. For example, tomorrow night we're holding a vigil at the other St Mark's in Fitzroy in support of trans people, and that's all about just getting trans people to speak to the rest of us, to remind everyone that trans people are human beings who, just like all of us, have got vulnerabilities, And I think that's the only thing that really changes people down here rather than just up here. Yeah. Look, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. Never let it be said that Indigenous people can't keep time. I've learned how to do this in the colonial system. So I think Joe's going to finish off now. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much, Gary. I hope that this conversation has helped us all move a little distance in that space, that place of us that is afraid and clings to power. It would be great to think about what next for those of us who have all the privileges of whiteness and are daily meeting people, like Keith said, of his mates at the bowls club, who you know, they're people for us to talk to. So I think we can all commit to doing that more knowledgeably as a result of tonight, and perhaps with more heart. Just a couple of things. Anybody in the area is very welcome to join us at our monthly learning group. We meet here at 12 o'clock every month. We're meeting this Sunday at 12. We discuss, we try to listen to Indigenous voices by reading or asking people to come visit. And we'd love you to join us. So perhaps, Barb, can I ask people to give you their email address? We will circulate a link to the recording of this event. And perhaps if in our learning group, certainly I think we will be having some conversations about where to next, what practical things that we can be doing. So even if you can't join us, if you would like to hear the fruit of our conversations, then perhaps give Barb your email address and she can keep you in the loop. Gary, thank you again. I have a small gift for you, which perhaps, depending on your Lenten vows, you may not be able to enjoy for a little longer, but yeah, thank you again. And yeah, let's...
Whiskey. Yes, it is in fact, you know, the Irish and Scots' best contribution to the colony. So thank you very much.
I tried to get a Tasmanian one, but they didn't have any. So
right.
yeah.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great night.